Hello, and welcome to the Alpha Male Podcast. The podcast where we own our manliness. We don't apologize for what we are. Made in the image of God, strong, dominant, and in control. We come at manliness the right way, from the truth, with God at the center. Today's episode is going to be another episode of Manly Pursuits. It seems like the feedback on that has been positive. So we'll put in the bio and then roll into the topic. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review, hit some stars on the podcast. If you want to check out stuff while you're listening, you can go to goodshepherdtraining.com. Before we roll into that, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment, leave a review of the podcast if you've listened to it before. Your one-stop shop to find out more, to see pictures, to contact me, to support anything like that is goodshepherdtraining.com. All one word, goodshepherdtraining.com. With that, the bio and then the topic, guys. So, who is the alpha male talking to you through the microphone? I am, first and foremost, a servant of God, made in His image. A follower, a brother, a teacher, a preacher, and a fisher of men. A little bit about my background. I grew up hunting and fishing, what most would consider poor in the backwoods of the southeastern United States. I joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. After my combat to the infantry in the Marine Corps, I was an urban warfare instructor in the United States Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. I also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. I did quite a few years in law enforcement. I worked for LAPD. I worked regular patrol assignments and more specialized assignments, fugitive recovery. I've also been a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency that I won't specify. I've been the commander of a tactical team, an SRT, special response team, in a large metropolitan area, where our primary job was to stop active shooters. NRA certified, FBI certified, and some other certifications, firearms instructor for a lot of years. I started competition shooting even before joining the Marine Corps at 17. State rifle and pistol champion a few times over. Been blessed to win more shooting competitions and more disciplines than I can recall. Blessed be the Lord my rock. Trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle. Psalm 144. I've been blessed to be a professional big game hunter and guide. I've hunted all over this beautiful country, putting meat on the table for sport and as a professional. I don't apologize for that. I've slain all manner of beasts, bears, the wolf, elk, mule deer, and whitetail deer, and I've been blessed to fish all over this beautiful country as well. And again, first and foremost, I am a servant of God and a follower of the ultimate alpha male, Jesus Christ. Alright, let's get into today's topic. It's going to be another installment of Manly Pursuits. Today's topic is going to be on fishing. Now, I should caveat this with, we could do an entire podcast on fishing. We could do an entire podcast on bass fishing. No doubt there's a podcast like that out there. This is not an all-inclusive thing on fishing. This is a Manly Pursuits episode to give you a broad, overarching, what I would consider an amorphous topic. First of all, I didn't mention in the bio, but my father is a commercial fisherman, which means that growing up, even before I joined in the Marine Corps, even way before that, I was spent time commercial fishing. That's not what we're going to be talking today for Manly Pursuits, because if you're a commercial fisherman, that's your occupation. Even this line can get, shall we say, a little bit brackish. But you can pretty clearly define fishing into saltwater and freshwater. We'll start with saltwater. Now, saltwater, a lot of people think of your big, what most would consider your sport fishing, your marlin, your tuna, big sport fish. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, because if you're going to do that, you're probably going to pay somebody to go out on a guided tour, or you already own a boat. You need a seaworthy vessel to go out and do that. You need quite a bit of tackle to do that. But that's, saltwater sport fishing for marlin, for swordfish, for tuna, which is a lot of fun. And if you haven't ever done that, I would encourage that. It is a lot of fun. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that today, because if you're already into that, you're going to know way more about that than we're going to cover today. And if you're not into it, you're probably going to have to pay a professional to take you out, because an ocean-going vessel is a sizable investment. I'd like to stay more focused on the DIY sort of fishing. Deep sea fishing would fall along those same lines. Probably not just DIYing that your first couple of times. The next closest to that would be surf fishing. You need to do it because you fish in the surf. You do it from the shore, so from a beach. It's surf fishing. You fish in the surf. We go out with a big rod and reel and cast it into the waves, where most people go swimming and surfing and boogie boarding and all that stuff, and you can catch fish there. There are fish in those waters. And that surf fishing, that's usually done with big spin reels and some kind of natural bait, which we'll get into more later. And then from there, probably an easier barrier to entry is going to be your bay fishing and your estuary fishing. You can do this with fairly minimal gear, with a spin rod or a bait cast rod. For your smaller, more manageable, usually you can catch a big fish doing this, but generally your smaller, more manageable species, your smaller shark species, your croaker, hardheads, or real common species, and there's a lot, I'm not going to name them all. This would include things like your saltwater trout, your saltwater bass. There's all kinds of subspecies of those. You think about your striper, things like that. Your flounder. Those are pretty common, species up and down the east and west coast. And I've mentioned a few things already, so I guess we'll cut this up. We'll talk about the tackle. We'll talk about fly rods specifically more later. But your general kinds of fishing rods, unless you're talking about little kids' push-button rods, are going to be the spin cast rod and your bait cast rod. Your spin cast rod you hold with the rod in your hand and the reel facing down to the ground. It has a spool. It has a little wire spool on the top that you flip to cast the line out, and you flip it back to reel the rod in. This is going to be much easier to use for your beginner. And this is what I would encourage most of you to start with if you don't know much about fishing. And again, that's a spin cast rod. The bail spins around when you reel it in. You flip the bail to cast it out. The next one is a bait cast rod. My personal favorite, but it is quite a bit to learn to fish with. And that's the rod you see when you're holding it in your hand and the reel is facing up towards the sky. It does not have a bail. The line goes straight in and straight out through a guide that moves back and forth and winds it on the spool. Those are your two main types of modern fishing rod and reel. Now, a spin cast rod and a spin cast reel go together, and a bait cast rod and a bait cast reel go together. Again, this is going to be very broad, but when you get the rod, it should say what kind of weight line it uses. There are a lot of different kinds of line. I really like braided line and spider wire and Spectra, but we're not even going to really discuss that. We're mostly going to talk about monofilament fishing line, which is your clear, what you would think of as more traditional fishing line. And it will say the weight on the rod that it recommends. For all-around fishing, whether we're talking about freshwater, which we'll get to, or the estuary, and bay fishing, which we just talked about, 10 pounds is pretty good. Anywhere from the 6 to 10 pound range for your line and your medium action rod is going to be where I recommend you start. We're talking about bay and estuary fishing, or you're closer to shore fishing. You can do that with generally a 6 foot or 7 foot medium action rod in either bait cast or spin cast and around 10 pound test. And your two main bait types, and I know there's a lot, but your two main bait types, we'll get into more specifics later. Those are going to be your artificial baits and your natural baits. Now, natural baits, your classic minnow your classic fish or animal products like a frog, and your insect products, which I would consider to include things like a crawfish or a crab or a clam, and the ultimates of classics when you think about fishing, a worm. So your natural baits, your minnows, your worms, and anything like that is your natural bait. And your artificial baits, typically called lures, are things to mimic natural food that your fish would eat. They're not a natural food, but you make a fish think that it's a natural food. A hunk of wood that men have carved to swim in the water and painted to look like a fish. Or a plastic frog that men have molded and used the same consistency to mimic a dying frog on the top of the water or a swimming frog on the top of the water. Those are just two examples of what a lure is. Lures can be broken down in a lot of different subcategories. Swim baits, when you think about your crankbaits and your stick baits, they're looked, like I said, to usually look like a crawfish or more commonly a minnow swimming through the water. And they can be set for all different depths. A deep diving crankbait goes way down deep in the water, or a stick bait that sticks pretty close to the surface of the water to look like a minnow. And then another big category would be your crankbaits and spinner baits. These have a shiny metal, what we refer to as a spoon, but a shiny metal object that spins around. And then underneath that you have a metal weight, usually led with a plastic skirt or a rubber skirt that moves and bounces. So when it's viewed from the underneath, it looks like a fish injured swimming through the water. And again, those are your crankbaits and spinner baits. And the next big category is your soft plastics. Soft plastics, you would probably think they were rubber. They're referred to as soft plastics in the fishing world. But they're like a soft plastic or a rubber bait that looks like a worm, looks like a crawfish, looks like a frog, looks like a minnow. That's a big category, and there's countless different varieties of those. But you mostly just refer to them as soft plastics. The next big category is going to be your hard metal baits. Those are going to be like shiny spoons and metal jigs. Sometimes you attach other things to them, feathers, rubber skirts to make them look more lively. Just a heavy, shiny piece of metal that goes in the water to attract fish. And another big category, and my personal favorite, is topwater. Those are things that splash the surface of the water like a popper to look like an injured or dying thing on the surface of the water. And the fish will come up and strike those on the surface of the water so you can see them. And those are your main categories of lures. And there are many other little subcategories and other little things we didn't talk about. We'll talk about fly fishing specifically later. But going back to your natural baits, there's basically two main ways that you fish a natural bait, say a minnow or a worm. You either fish it from the top or from the bottom. I guess your quintessential thing that most people think of when they think about fishing and they don't know a lot about it is a fishing pole with a bobber, which fishes from the top. So a plastic device that floats on the surface of the water, or back in days of yore, a wooden bobber that floats on the surface of the water with a little piece of line hanging down in the water with a worm or a minnow on it. That's kind of your classic fishing thing that people think of. And that would be fishing from the top. So fishing with regular bait from the top of the water. And your other way would be a sinker. And, obviously that sinks the bait to the bottom. So just a heavy chunk of lead that sinks the weight to the bottom, wherever the bottom of the water is, however deep it is. It sinks the bait to the bottom, and then it either floats a little bit above that, or it just lays on the bottom floor of the river or the lake or the bay or wherever you're fishing. Talked thus far about saltwater fishing. We'll talk about freshwater fishing. All those things we talked about in the transition apply to freshwater fishing, your spin cast rods, your bait cast rods, and your two big categories of live bait and lures or artificial baits. I'll subcategorize freshwater fishing into the main types of fishing you're going to do. You have your main one that most people think of as sport fishing for freshwater is your bass fishing, largemouth and smallmouth bass. Probably next to that is going to be your panfish, which encompasses a lot of different species of freshwater fish. If you hear about pan fishing, a big one is crappie. Crappie's a big, freshwater sports species, in the panfish family. But it also includes most of your sunfish, and there's a lot of different subcategories of sunfish, your bluegill, your mouth, pumpkin seed, and many others, and things like your small perch, your yellow perch. And there's more specialized stuff, like pike and muskie. We're not really going to talk about that. That's more of a specialized niche thing. Your other big category for freshwater is going to be your catfishing. Catfishing almost exclusively is done with dead, live bait. More traditional bait like a dead, stinking piece of meat, a chicken liver, or a hot dog is a pretty classic one. Or I guess what they would call synthetic natural baits, like they're just power bait, is a real common brand that's used to just make really atrociously, horribly smelling things in water, because catfish eat dead, rotten things. You'll almost always fish catfish from the bottom. You can do things like jug fishing and trot line fishing, which are more specialized. I'm not going to get into that today. They're illegal in a lot of places. But if you're talking about fishing with a rod and reel, generally catfishing is done from the bottom. There are exceptions, but you fish it with a sinker, with bait from the bottom. You talk about pan fishing. Pan fishing can be done. Obviously, the fish they fit in a pan. If you didn't know that, that's why they're called pan fish. They're small. So you're going to use very small hooks and very small baits. The good thing about pan fishing is they're a good barrier. They're a good low barrier to entry. Generally, if you get a spot of them, you'll catch many of them. It'll be a lot more lively and a lot more fun. And they'll hit on all different kinds of bait, providing it's small enough to fit in their mouth. They're very aggressive fish. Little artificial plastic baits that look like little tiny bugs, or little tiny minnows, or actual live bait itself, little pieces of worm, little tiny minnows. You can catch them from the top. You can catch them fishing with bobbers from the top or fishing from the bottom. You can catch them with all kinds of artificial bait. Your swim baits, your smaller crankbaits and stick baits, to little specialized crappie jigs, which is like a little baby version of the spinner baits we talked about. You can pretty much fish with all different kinds of colors. And like I said, a pretty easy barrier to entry, pan fishing. And like the name implies, they fit in a pan and they're delicious. Next we get into bass fishing. That's probably the fancier, more mainstream fishing. I do really enjoy bass fishing, especially like I said, from top water when the water is warm enough. But bass fishing can be done with more traditional baits like your worms and your minnows. It certainly is effective. If you're fishing for putting meat on the table, I would definitely say it's very effective. Most people that bass fish do it for the sporting aspect, and you do it with all the manner of lures we talked about earlier. Your top water on the top, to your spinner baits, to your crank baits. Again, are like carved pieces of wood or plastic that look like a fish swimming in water. And there is something satisfying as a man, of taking a thing that's artificial and tricking a fish into biting it. And again, if you're going to start with that, a spin cast reel in a medium action and a 10-pound fishing line weight is pretty good for a variety of the things we talked about. If you're talking about pan fishing, you probably want a smaller rod or medium lightweight action rod with, 4 to 6 pound test for fishing line. The next one that's kind of its own thing, it kind of is to the rest of fishing we talked about, like archery is to shooting. There are some commonalities like breath control and finesse and things like that, but fly fishing is really its own animal. The rod and reel are completely different. The lure are completely different. It's called fly fishing because you use bait that looks like flies. They look like little tiny bugs. And it's different than all other fishing in that the fly weighs very, very little. So you're not actually casting the bait. You actually have a heavy, thick plastic line. You're actually using the inertia of the rod moving back and forth to throw the line out. And the fly happens to be on a very small, light leader that happens to be attached to the heavy fishing line. So you'll have your heavy, thick plastic fishing line that you use the inertia of the rod to throw out. And then you'll have a really small, light, monofilament, clear leader of fishing line with a very light fly attached to the end of it. And you kind of move it through the air like a whip and let it swoop out and fly out through the air with that fly on the end. land on the surface of the water. This can be done for bass and things, but it's almost exclusively done for trout in streams. Yeah, you can fly fish in lakes, you can do bass and panfish, but that's really an anomaly. Most people that do this do it in mountain streams, and they do it for trout, your trout species, and salmon. It's a very, set apart discipline, a very romantic way of fishing. I do enjoy it, but it's very specific to a certain kind of alpine environment generally. It is a good way of fishing and often the only legal way of taking those kind of fish, like a rainbow trout in a mountain stream. I know we talked about a lot in this episode. I know we threw out a lot of terms, and I'm trying to break it down as simple as possible. I'm hoping that these Manly Pursuits episodes get you back into things that you don't do as often as maybe we should as men, or hopefully, by God's grace, you're inspired to try fishing for the first time if you've never done it. I think of the Manly Pursuits we've talked about thus far, next to hiking, this probably has the next lowest barrier of entry. If you're listening to this, likely you have some kind of electronic device. And if you can afford that, you can likely afford a cheap, spin cast fishing rod, somewhere between 4 to 10 pound test line. And likely, since most humans live near, the vast majority of humans live near a coast or near a river, because that's where we settled and built cities, you likely have somewhere nearby that you can fish. I know that a lot of people in Europe, hunting is a very, very expensive hobby, which sadly has been kind of carved out for the elite and wealthy, but fishing not so, and even so here in America. Most men, if they're not making excuses, can get out and fish if you want to. I know that we all have time constraints, and you may not have or want to spend time for fishing in your life because you have other manly pursuits. If you do want to get into it, I want to give you a good place to start. Like I said, that common spin rod with your 6 to 10 pound test, you can get out to a body of water near you, whether it's saltwater, a bay, or an estuary, or freshwater, a river, or a lake. The number one thing I'm going to recommend is that setup with a lure specifically called the original Rapala. They're made in one of the Scandinavian countries, I believe Finland, maybe somewhere else in Scandinavia. They're your quintessential classic lure, and it looks like a little tiny black and white minnow, about the size of your thumb. And what's great about that kind of minnow, there are a lot of different species that look like that. In almost any environment, there's a predatory fish that will attack that lure. Whether it's a mountain river, or an alpine lake, or the swamps of Florida, or an irrigation pond in the Midwest, likely in any of those environments, something is going to hit that lure. You don't have to worry about keeping live bait or going out and buying worms fresh that day, or going out and catching or finding minnows. If you want to do all that stuff, that's great, and that's the next place I'm going to tell you to start. But just get that regular spinning rod and an original Rapala lure. You can look it up. Almost anywhere that sells fishing stuff is going to sell that tackle. And like I said, you just go out and cast it out and reel it in. You can get fancy and jerk it and do all kinds of different things with it. But what I love about that lure is, like I said, almost any environment that you're going to find predatory fish in, you can catch fish with that. You can even catch an aggressive panfish on an original Rapala. You can catch a giant largemouth bass on it. You can catch a trout. You can catch your saltwater species on it. So like I said, a very good place to start. They do have some downsides. If you're fishing somewhere with a lot of places to get something snagged on, they get caught on lily pads, get caught on logs, things like that. But it is a good, easy place to start. Your next place to start is going to be your classic, quintessential, go out with your rod and reel, put a bobber on it. About 6 to 10 inches below that, you tie a hook, and you put a worm on it and throw it out in the water. Put a minnow on it. A minnow is probably better than a worm because there's not much out there that won't eat a minnow. You toss that out into the water and you sit and wait, and if you get impatient or you don't think it's a good spot, you throw it somewhere else. And like I said, there's a lot of different ways to fish. You may decide that, you live in, central Idaho, and fly fishing is the best place for you to start because that's mostly what you're going to be able to do there. Or, you may live on a bay, so estuary fishing or bay fishing with live bait may be the best thing for you. But that's a good place to start. And I hope this has given you some thoughts about fishing. If you've ever wanted to try fishing and maybe it was just too overwhelming, maybe now you know a little bit more. Walk into a fishing store or a big box store and kind of pick out things to get you started. And honestly, a podcast is not the best place to learn to cast, things like that, or to tie a tri-polymer knot or a polo knot. Those are much better done on YouTube or with pictures, so go to those resources and look those up. Oh, another cool thing about that Rapala is when you get it in the box, unless they've changed it, it comes in a cardboard box. It actually has a picture editorial in there on how to tie a knot for that lure, which is pretty cool. You can't just go out and tie a regular shoelace knot in fishing line. It just is not probably going to work. The knots to fishing are pretty specific to fishing. But I think that fishing is a manly pursuit. It's a way to put meat on the table. Even if you do hunt, even if you do forage, even if you do all those things, it's another, as they say, tool in the toolbox. It's another way to put meat on the table. And it's another way to get out and escape the cube life, escape your cubicle, escape the cube that you live in, the cube that you drive to work in, and get out into nature and have dominion over nature the way you were created to by God. It's a good way to do that. And even if you don't catch anything, it's a good way to just be outside and enjoy God's creation. With that, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Alpha Male Podcast. Again, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and leave a review of the podcast. Your one-stop shop for more, go to goodshepherdtraining.com. Again, goodshepherdtraining.com. If you want to support financially, because these podcasts are free for you to listen to, and I like it that way, but they're not free to put out and produce. Feel free to go to goodshepherdtraining.com and scroll down to Patreon for the fraction of the cost of a rod, reel, or even a lure, or a can of worms. You can support this podcast and the message. If you have it in your heart to give, and if you don't feel guilty about it. My God supplies all my needs. And again, it costs nothing to like, subscribe, and comment, and leave a review of the podcast. As a thanks for staying tuned to the end of the episode, I'll throw out a tactical tip. This one will have to do with fishing. If you're going to fish in an area, whether it's a river, or a lake, or pretty much anywhere, look for transition zones. Your predatory fish are generally going to like those transition zones. So anywhere where it's shady to light, or light to shady, or anywhere where you have a strong current going into no current, or somewhere where you have lily pads transitioning into open water, those predatory fish like an ambush, and they like those areas. And even your less predatory fish are going to like a transition area, so you can catch fish that are in both environments. So try putting your bait on the edge of that transition zone where it transitions from one thing to another. At the edge of, where the tree shade is into the sunny, open water. Or the Turner River, where the swirls turn into more slack water from a heavy current to a less heavy current. Or on the edge of a weed bed or a lily pad field. There are exceptions, but if you don't know where to start, those are good areas to throw your line. Thanks for listening. Get out there, be alpha males. Be strong, and prove yourself a man. Have a blessed day.